the meantime, I would like to take the opportunity to welcome you all to this webinar, Connecting the Dots, Addressing Climate and Human Rights Risks under the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. My name is Valentina Bolognesi. I'm a Senior Advocacy and Engagement Advisor at amfori, and it is really my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar that is jointly organized by amfori, the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, with the support of the German Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights. A couple of words about amfori, if we could move to the next slide, please. For those who might not be familiar with the organization that we represent, amfori is a business association. The slide is not yet moving, but it will soon move. We are a business association that helps make supply chain sustainability easier. We deliver solutions like amfori BSEI across the ESG spectrum that support companies with risk management, from supply chain mapping all the way to reporting. We have offices in Brussels and also 2 offices in APAC. We have more than 2,400 members from more than 50 countries and more than 58,000 suppliers from more than 120 sourcing countries. Taking a look at today's webinar, it comes as part of a series of webinars on due diligence laws in practice, where we break down aspects of emerging due diligence laws, such as the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and we also always offer practical insights into how to do due diligence. So very happy to have this 15th webinar being organized today. Now, let's take a look at the housekeeping rules for the day. You are muted. Nevertheless, we do encourage you to engage with us through the Q&A functionality. Please post your questions there. We're going to have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar. The aim is for us to address many of your questions either orally or in writing, but we also realize that we have a very dense agenda today, so apologies in advance in case we were unable to address all of your questions. The webinar is being recorded, and the slides plus the recording will be shared with you after the webinar. We're also going to share a quick satisfaction survey, so please do let us know what you thought of this webinar, if we can improve in any way going forward. The last piece of information in terms of housekeeping rules is that this webinar is also for the auditors amongst you in the audience. This webinar is being recognized by APSCA, the Association of Professional Social Compliance Auditors, as a continuous professional development training under the code AM005. You will find all the information on APSCA website. If there is any questions, do not hesitate to either reach out to APSCA or to us. Now, the agenda for today. Why this topic and what do we aim to achieve with this webinar? I think the trajectory of the climate crisis is very clear. Temperatures are rising constantly over the year. If until very recently climate change and human rights were regarded as topics in isolation, in reality it's becoming the more and more clear and evident that actually those topics intersect and interact very closely. Heat stress is one example of the interlinkage between climate change and human rights and impacts on workers. So what we're going to do through this webinar is hopefully to raise awareness and build a better understanding of the impacts of rising global temperatures on workers. We're going to do this through the expert input of Alshka from the ILO and Matthias from La Isla Network. They will really set the scene as to what the problem is all about, what it is that we are observing, what the data tell us, but also look into some of the solutioning, some of the measures that can be taken to really prevent and address the problem of rising global temperatures and their impacts on workers. Then, through the help of Michela from the German Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights, we are going to understand and get clarifications on the due diligence expectations stemming from, amongst other, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, what this means in terms of workers' health and safety in a context of global rising temperatures, And then with Sasha Monique from Vinnopolet, an amfori member, we're going to be learning about emerging practice, and in particular how Vinnopolet has embarked on a journey to identifying and to addressing the topic of heat stress as a salient risk in their supply chains. As alluded to, also a Q&A session at the end. And in the interest of time, I would really want to now introduce Alška Drazic, Dr. I should say, Alška Drazic, technical specialist on occupational safety and health at the International Labour Organization, for Alška to really set the scene and help us understand what the problem is, what the ILO has documented and observed, and what actually kind of measures can be put in place to address the problem. Thank you. Over to you, Alška.
Thank you so much, Valentina, and thank you to amfori colleagues for organizing this very timely webinar. I'm Hoshka Gracek from the International Labour Organization. For those of you not familiar with the ILO is the oldest specialized UN agency. It was created in 1919 with the goal to ameliorate workers' rights, moving towards social justice, and a framework for rights at the workplace. Now, the ILO is unique because we have a tripartite governing body. So we work very closely with governments, 187 member states, but also with workers' unions and with employers' organizations. And in this way, we're able to have direct access to the workplace, but also to the legislative framework to try to make changes from the national level down to the enterprise level. Next slide, please. And today we will be talking about heat at work, about heat stress, the impact of workers, but it's critical from the very beginning that we understand that workers are very rarely in the climate crisis exposed to only heat alone. Workers do not work in a bubble. When they're working outside in high temperatures, they're also very much exposed to UV radiation, air pollution, potentially natural disasters and extreme weather events, as well as secondary impacts, changes in vector distribution, the need for greater use of agrochemicals. So there is a cocktail of hazards that we need to take into account when we're talking about climate impacts for workers. However, we do see that heat is the one that has gotten the most attention. It is the most visible. It's led the UN Secretary General to call a global call to action on heat, where the ILO reports were launched that showed the results of a global study finding that a majority of the world's workers are exposed to excessive heat and are potentially at a threat to their safety and health. To establish what heat at work means, excessive heat, heat stress, these different terminologies, it's critical to note that all humans have a core body temperature of around 37 degrees. It's essential for maintaining normal function. So we are all exposed to extreme heat. Extreme heat is a public health issue. However, workers have a very unique exposure profile. Workers are exposed to the excessive heat that we all may be exposed to. However, they also are working in high physical activity. They already have metabolic heat that's generating, that's being when they're performing different types of work. They have thermal insulation, heavy PPE due to the types of tasks they're performing. If we're thinking about firefighters or workers spraying pesticides or working with chemicals or simply wearing construction gear. We also have to remember that workers are limited in the way of getting themselves out of the extreme heat. We are able to make the decisions to cool ourselves down. Workers in many cases are not able to leave the workplace in order to do that. And so there's a number of different factors that put workers at higher risk. And when we talk about some of the health impacts, we have the ones that are very visible. We're talking about heat stress that could lead to things like heat cramps, heat rashes, the very first signs. However, the thing is that heat stress causes a cascade of reactions. So very quickly, the mild effects of heat stress can move onto things like heat exhaustion, heat stroke, which can lead to fatalities. And in addition to the effects from the heat alone, there's also an increased risk of injuries and accidents. at the workplace due to hot temperatures, due to ill-functioning equipment, altered emotional states, different types of PPE that's being used. And something also that has been brought to the attention of the ILO are the mental health impacts from the heat, not only because of potential losses to productivity and closures of workplaces, but also because of difficulties in sleeping, difficulties in focusing and concentration, which can then lead to the injuries. So there are different types of health impacts that need to be considered. So from the global research that the ILO has conducted recently that was launched last year, we find that a majority of the world's workers are exposed at some point to excessive heat. More than 2.4 billion workers around the world, representing more than 70% of the global working population. We know that this results in at least 22.8 million non-fatal injuries happening at the workplace, resulting in around 20,000 deaths. However, we know that these numbers are likely underestimated due to the difficulties in reaching a lot of the workplaces, due to the high levels of informality around the world as well. And we see on the blue part of the slide the fact that all regions are affected. However, they're affected differently. We know that regions with the highest workforce exposure to excessive heat are those regions that have classically hotter temperatures. Regions like the Arab states, Asia and the Pacific, in Africa. We also know that the region with the highest proportion of occupational injuries are also those countries with historically higher heat. 77.2% of all occupational injuries related to heat in Africa, 6.7% in the Americas. However, we see a very interesting trend to the regions that not have historically high temperatures. For example, in the European and Central Asia region, where we see that this is the region with the most rapidly increasing workforce exposure to excessive heat, and also the region with the most rapidly increasing heat-related injuries. Therefore, policies that respond to this threat need to take into account the regional differences and how quickly the injury rates are changing. Next slide, please. A few more statistics for you. We know that in terms of the money saved, if we had appropriate occupational safety and health measures in place, 360 billion could be saved globally. Financially, this is a huge impact, not only because of productivity losses, but also because of different health-related costs for workers and for broader communities. Now, I want to draw your attention here to all the blue part of the slide, which was a very critical outcome of this global research that the ILO conducted that found that, in fact, we have a moment in time called heat waves, official definitions of when there are extreme temperatures crossing a certain threshold over a certain number of days. However, what we found is that a majority of occupational injuries for workers are happening outside of the moment of an official heat wave. Now, this is a critical finding. This says that it's not only when we declare an official heat wave. Workers are suffering and are incurring injuries when it's just hot outside, when you have excessive heat, but not yet to the point of excessive heat, of a heat wave, showing that we have to take policy steps to protect workers before this official heat wave. Once we reach that moment, it is too late for the workplace. It's too late for the enterprise. Workers are experiencing those impacts much before. Next slide, please. Another important consideration, I've mentioned the immediate impacts of the heat stress. So things like heat exhaustion, the injuries that are happening. However, there's also a number of chronic health impacts. So we see that over a period of time, having exposures to heat leads to increases in inflammation, leads to impacts on the cardiovascular system as well as the renal system, and is a major contributor to chronic kidney disease. So our calculations have showed that there are certain regions that are very much impacted. We see here the Asian region that has more than 20 million cases of chronic kidney disease that could be attributable to heat stress. So another important outcome to consider when we're looking at responses, that it's not only about the acute impacts, but also potentially the long-term impacts for workers. And here's just a summary slide with a lot of figures on purpose to show again this concept of the cocktail of hazards. We're not just looking at the injuries and the health impacts from the workers exposed to heat alone. We must consider the interlinkages between different exposures at the workplace, and therefore have policies, workplace policies, that are very much aware of the different types of risks and how they can be interlinked. Now, I think I've given a lot of evidence of the problem. We have documented this throughout the region and through different regions and throughout different countries. However, there are responses. There are things that we can do. The ILO has been working very long at developing policy responses at three levels, at the international level, the national level, but also at the enterprise level, ensuring that there's a spirit of social dialogue throughout all of those different factors, and making sure that the workers and employers and governments are all working together to develop some of these policies and coordination. Now, to start, this is a reminder that even though some of the climate risks that we're facing are getting more intense, more extreme, they are not by any means new hazards for the workplace. The ILO has been dealing with these types of hazards and developing standards for heat, for ultraviolet radiation, for air pollution for decades, since its inception. And so we have a very solid framework of international labor standards that deal with these health threats and that set out how to establish enterprise level occupational safety and health management systems to deal with things like excessive heat, with potentially natural disasters, with ultraviolet radiations. And these are all found throughout our different standards. Two that I want to draw your particular attention to today are the fundamental occupational safety and health standards. These are our Convention 155 and 187. And the reason that they're so critical in this discussion today, when we're talking about the intersection with human rights, is that in 2022, the International Labor Conference of the ILO decided to include a safe and healthy working environment as a fundamental principle and right at work. This means that all member states have an obligation to promote and to realize the right to a safe and healthy working environment, whether or not they have ratified these conventions. So we have moved to a paradigm shift to a more of a rights-based approach when we're looking at safety and health. We're looking at the obligations of not only the member states, but also of the employers that are present at the enterprise. And in addition to the basic international labor standards and the ones that govern occupational safety and health, a global review that the ILO conducted looked at a variety of policy responses, and they can range from many different things. We can look at national OSH legislation, collective bargaining agreements between employers and workers, technical guidelines that are developed by national authorities, different training programs, as well as public health initiatives that try to target workers. Now, in the next slide, the next slide shows what the ILO found as the building blocks, the most critical elements of legislation to deal with heat stress, and the most common provisions. Now, these are provisions that are integrated in the national law, but then trickle down to the enterprise level. So these are things that businesses should be aware of. So these start with things like making sure that you have risk assessment in the working environment, so you know who is most at risk when it comes to exposures. It's about identifying and developing targeted strategies for those workers most at risk, whether we're talking about informal workers, we're talking about female or elderly workers, migrant workers, those that might face the greatest risk. We looked at the basics of setting maximum temperature limits, making sure that you have workplace level strategies such as hydration, rest breaks, cool shaded rest areas, education and awareness, making sure that you have health monitoring, all the basic things that usually make up an occupational safety and health framework at the national level should also be adapted for heat stress. So it's also not starting from scratch. It's using the existing elements of occupational safety and health frameworks and adapting them to heat stress. And here on purpose, I included this slide because it has a lot of figures, it has a lot of information, but this is to show you an example of where we are right now and the complexity of policy responses when it comes to maximum temperature limits, which is one of the most used policy responses by national governments that has given the obligation to businesses and enterprises to implement. So here you see the examples of different types of maximum temperature thresholds that are used in different countries and different regions. And you see already the complexities. We see that countries use different types of heat stress indicators, whether that's wet bulb, whether that's just heat index, whether that's air temperature, whether that's indoor or outdoor temperatures, whether we're looking at work intensity and setting standards for low, medium, and high intensity work. So we see that we have a challenge, even though we've established the basic building blocks of what needs to be present, there's still a lot of work to do when it comes to establishing a methodology and a sector-specific and work task-specific approach to maximum temperature thresholds. So where do we go from here? I think I've shared already a lot of examples of what we're doing and some of the response mechanisms. But the ILO is very much working with our member states, with our workers, and with our employer groups throughout the world to try to implement the UN call to action on extreme heat, making sure that the ILO is leading the agenda for all world of work issues and for establishing the rights to implement different policy responses for different types of sectors, not just outdoor workers, but also indoor workers, informal economy as well, looking at the different priorities for different sectors and different types of businesses. Now, moving towards a sort of coordination of policy response, the ILO will be holding the first ever global tripartite meeting on occupational safety and health and extreme weather events and changing weather patterns. This will be the first time that we bring together governments, workers, and businesses to develop a harmonized approach to policy guidance. Our date is in 2026. We're still developing exactly when the precise date will be, but we're very much looking forward to hearing from those stakeholders to establish a basic policy guideline that can then be implemented and adapted to various sectors. I think I'll end it here, Valentina. I'll pass it back to you. There's a lot to discuss today, but I'm very happy to answer any questions and get into the details from the global perspective of the ILO. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alshka, for providing this macro level overview of the problem at stake and also some of the multi-dimensional responses in terms of policy, and also for giving us an overview of some of the upcoming work that will be coordinated by the ILO. Now, I would like to turn to Matthias, Director of European Development at La Isla Network. So we're going to continue zooming in on the impacts of those global rising temperatures on workers. And I very much look forward to hearing more about the on-the-ground work that is conducted by La Isla Network, what some of the data that you have collected actually shows, what some of the good practices looks like, and what companies, because now we're going to also try and understand a little bit what can be done, right, by companies, by first taking a deeper look at what heat stress is, but then maybe also giving us some ideas of what can be done in practice, and maybe you will also tell us a little bit about the return on investment of all this. Over to you, Matthias.
Yes, I will, Valentina. Thank you. And I first of all want to thank you for inviting me, and it's a privilege for La Isla Network to actually share our work, on-the-ground work with over 10 years of data, but also learn from your experiences and listen to your questions, and also of the other speakers. I want to start with saying that workers all over the world sustain us every day, often under very difficult circumstances, difficult conditions, and especially with the changing climate at the moment. And these same workers, they face growing and growing risk, as Alshka explained before, and from preventable heat-related illnesses and injuries. So I think we have the opportunity, but also the responsibility to ensure that those who put food on our table or produce our raw materials are actually really protected, because I think no one should fall ill or even lose their life just because of doing their work. I think that's a really important message for me personally, but also for Leighton Network. Our organization is a global non-for-profit organization. We work in the field of occupational safety and health, research and advisory. We work a lot with international organizations and companies, and our core goal is protecting workers in the face of climate change, while at the same time, it's really important as well, guaranteeing productivity and also, for example, food production. And we are independent, data-driven, and always in collaboration with global institutions and universities. Where we are, we can see that on the next slide. So we
I do not know whether it is just me, but I think we are losing Matthias. Let's maybe give it a few seconds to see whether the connection improves. So we lost you.
I'm still here.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Hear us.
Is it okay now, or?
It is. I think there is a
Okay.
little bit of a delay.
Oh, okay. I'm in the Netherlands, so it isn't that far away.
So let us maybe go back indeed to where you are, the industries that you work in.
Yes, you can see them here on the screen. So we work in agriculture, construction, mining, textiles, and garment with many companies that you can see on the screen here. So we did a lot of projects in Central and South America, Nepal, the United States, and also in Europe. And we have teams all over the world, actually, also in India and in Latin and Central America. Just to focus a bit on heat stress, Halska explained a bit about it before, so I'll keep it short, but this is a very complex slide, but to explain it simply, it's not just about temperature. Heat stress comes from a combination of the outside temperature, humidity, the wind, solar radiation, and of course, combined with the muscular work, the type of work someone is doing, the workload is very important. The clothing is very important. Also, the body heat production is very important. And what we see on the next slide for us, with over 10 years of experience, our key objective in the field is to actually keep the core body temperature below the 38 degrees Celsius, to keep people healthy, to keep people fit. This is for us the core goal we have when we go into the field. We hear a lot about agriculture when talking about heat stress, but it's good just to mention short that it's not only agriculture, it's mining, construction, factory workers, fisheries, the first responders, transport and logistics. Many sectors actually face the same challenges. And it's also not a problem from the global south alone. It's also a European issue. We have all been experiencing that we've seen record-breaking temperatures, the driest summer of the year, the hottest month. It goes on and on and on and on. And temperatures in Europe are rising twice the global average. So that's a big risk, and the results are pretty shocking, to be honest. You can see that on the next slide. We've seen a 30% increase in heat-related mortality over the past 2 decades. Economic losses are huge, 1.5% of GDP in some countries. Loss of labor hours up to 83% more than in the 1990s. Agricultural workers are 35 times more at risk than others. So not only workers are at risk, also elderly people, just normal people living in cities where there's not enough cooling areas, not enough parks, for example, not enough trees. So we are all at risk, also in Europe. And I can say our health, but also our industries are at serious risks. I want to say I'm happy to see that this is now also in the news. I'm not happy to say it because it shouldn't be, but we also see it back in the headlines now. So in September 2023, we saw 6 vineyard workers died of heat stroke during the harvest in the Champagne area, in the Bordeaux area. That's up north in France, the Champagne area. So it's pretty high up in Europe. If I would start driving now, it's only 5 hours away. And you see the next 2 slides as well, similar reports from Italy, France, Qatar, and many other countries. And we know many more workers are suffering in silence, because this is just the tip of the iceberg, because there's more we don't know than we do know. So maybe it's important to go to the next step, because there's good news. The good news is we know what works. For over 10 years, Laser Network has worked hand in hand with companies, governments, and researchers, and very important, also with the workers themselves, to design and refine practical solutions. So simple, powerful workplace interventions based on the principles of rest, shade, hydration, and hygiene. So we've tested them in real world conditions, and they work, and they really get results. So we can do something. That's really good news. Looking at the results at the next slide, is that we've seen at our Center of Excellence in Nicaragua. So we've developed and tested these protocols together with the researchers and the companies and the workers. And after 3 years, we saw some amazing results that, to be honest, also surprised the most optimistic souls within our own organization. So we've seen 80% fewer heat-related illnesses, a drop in chronic kidney disease of 70%, and up to a 20% increased productivity. How that came about, I will explain in the next slides. But then we found after 3 years a 60% return on investment. So this was and is a real business value. Just to take a closer look, this slide is about the most dangerous jobs in the sugarcane fields of Central America. If we zoom in, what we saw here at the left side, you see that there's during the day only one long break, that's the lunch break, and the rest of the day the workers kept working. And you see here before any interventions, so this is the baseline, that there was a 21% of incident kidney injury. After a couple of years, started working on improving the workplace conditions and also implementing the protocols. You see at the right side that we created many short breaks in the shade, hydrated, with good hygiene facilities. So we kept the core body temperatures of the most dangerous and heavy jobs below the 38 degrees Celsius. There was only 1% incident kidney injury left. Looking at the productivity, people started, because of the breaks, working fewer hours. So there was a bit of a concern also with workers getting paid by piece rate, but also with the companies who are relying on productivity, of course, that there was going to be a big issue. But then you see after the interventions, people started working less. That's the yellow line starting on the top end of the graphic, and actually started producing more. They almost doubled production. And what happened here is people were just fit, healthy, and were able to keep going on. It's the same when you go to the gym, you have a short break of 1 minute, you have the new energy to continue doing your sports exercise. And this is in the field with sometimes 40 degrees Celsius. So switching one long break for many short breaks in the shade and ensuring constant hydration was the key, and the workers stayed cool and healthy. So this is a win for the workers and for the producers. So I've shown the ROI before, the return on investment. Every dollar invested by the company, they got back $1.60. In the next slide, I'll explain how. Because what we saw here, of course, the higher productivity was a major part of it, but also lower staff turnover. The absenteeism was reduced, less accidents. Accidents cost money as well. Of course, you have to take care of your people. The hospital care was reduced, and the workforce was healthy. And also you can see improved finance terms from development banks. So your entire company industry environment gets more healthy and more interesting, and so you are able to actually make more money while taking care of your people. So what could your organization or your company do? You assess your risk, you address them, and you then start implementing them and refining them and improving them. So we at Laser Network, we measure workplace conditions and health risks. We do that through underground research. So we measure core body temperatures of workers. We strap them up with a monitor. We measure their heart rate, their workload. We do surveys with workers on their knowledge. Do they know they have to drink a lot of water? Do they know they have to take breaks? And so we also ask them about the practices, because often you see the policy is pretty good of a company, but the practices in the field are different. So the policy review is very important for us as well, to know whether a company is aware of the issue. All that together creates a credible data set, an overview of the gaps still available in the policy, but also in practice. And that's the starting point for targeted action. Then we address the issues with the protocol we've developed. I explained before. So we organize more breaks in the shade, reliable potable water, and accessible hygiene facilities. Especially important, I want to stress it, for female workers who need to feel safe to relieve them, often in a field with a lot of male workers. It's good to know that the protocol sounds simple, but you have to adjust the protocol to the sector. You can imagine that, for example, lettuce farm in Spain is something completely different than a construction site in India or the UK. So you still work with the same protocol, but you have to refine and adjust to the region and to the type of work, the sector. The third part, the assist, not to be underestimated. So when you have a working protocol, you have to make sure that the implementing process is going to be perfect, because you need to train the people. There's going to be a major change management component, because you need the buy-in from all workers, from the worker, from middle management, and from upper management. For example, when one supervisor doesn't know the project that well or doesn't agree, and he just doesn't give the workers a breaks, the protocol won't work. So you need to buy in from at every level, actually. Our ambition is to also build centers of excellence in different sectors in Europe and India and Africa and the United States. So we've done it in Central America. We should do it also in other regions, in other sectors. We know what to do, we know how it works. And if you have one center of excellence in a region, you can actually use the outcomes for all companies, all types of same types of workers in the entire region. So this is our ambition, to work together with governments, with companies, with multinational organizations, to start building on centers of excellence in Europe. Before I give the word back to Valentina, I just want to stress that I think it's really important that we stop treating worker protection only as a cost. It is the right thing to do. It's also a competitive advantage. So you reduce your risk, you prevent costly incidents, you lower your insurance costs, and you boost your SDG impact or your ESG impact. So with this CSDDD, companies have the obligation. We have the proven protocols, so there is a solution, and together we can actually protect workers and ensure the compliance. We understand that's really important, and also build more resilient supply chains that still make your company profitable, because we also understand that companies often need to be profitable and produce for the entire world and for the consumers. So in the end, I think it's not necessary that anyone gets sick or die because of doing their job, and we can prevent it. And I just hope with webinars like this, with organizations like yours, that we start doing it from tomorrow on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for reminding us of the fact that this is not just a problem that is confined to very deep tiers in the supply chain or just certain regions of the world. You also made it very clear that it is also a European reality nowadays, precisely because of the rising global temperatures that are also affecting Europe and equally various regions of the world. You also said it very clearly. There is a protocol that works, that has been proven to be working through, amongst others, the work that you've done on the ground by La Isla Network. You also made it very clear that this protocol needs tailoring, because the problem actually concerns not just one industry or not just one sector. Therefore, that is probably one of the complexities attached to it, but the protocol exists, so it can be done. You also spoke a lot about the competitive advantage of doing it right, of doing it now. And you also talked about CSDDD, right? So I think that makes it for a nice segue into the next intervention, which is by Michaela Streibelt from the German Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights. And I would also want to just remind the audience that there is an opportunity to ask questions. Therefore, do please include questions in the Q&A box. We are seeing some coming through, but please do not be shy. And now, of course, CSDDD is a piece of legislation that has already been adopted. It is now being partly renegotiated, so that is a separate conversation, but we're going to look at CSDDD as adopted. We're going to look at actually the climate provision and also thinking of workers' protection. How does it work to do due diligence? What it means to put in place the due diligence duty in terms of risk analysis, preventative and mitigation measures, stakeholder engagement. So some of that will be touched on by Michaela. So I'm very happy to give you the floor and for you to walk us through what it means concretely and get some clarifications from CSDDD standpoint. Over to you, Misha.
Yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, we have a full agenda and I have many slides. So let's move to the next one and one more. So I'll quickly introduce the help desk to you on the next slide, please. But I'll keep it brief. We're a German government funded support service for businesses and business associations. And on the next slide, you can see an overview over our services. Next slide, please. Sorry. I will not go through all of this, but just a quick remark. The orange underlined words, these are hyperlinks, so feel free to check them out if you're interested. A lot of these are tools that are free of charge for companies in Germany as well as for companies everywhere around the world. And now, without further ado, I'll actually start at looking at climate change and the CSDDD. Before we do, Valentina already mentioned it, a couple of things are being potentially renegotiated, but I'll mention these as I go along. And yeah, on the next slide, please. When talking about climate change and the CSDDD, most people immediately think of the climate plan according to Article 22, which we'll also touch upon. But as we've just heard from Halschka and from Matthias, climate change is also creating hazards in relation to workers and hazards in relation to heat, but also hazards in relation to a couple of other aspects, as Halschka mentioned, a cocktail of hazards that are created by climate change. And these have to be addressed in the context of the CSDDD to the extent as to they relate to a protected legal position, to a protected human right or environmental obligation that's governed by the CSDDD. And to the extent that this is the case, companies have to deal with it in the due diligence management system, the risk management system that the CSDDD prescribes, which means they have to have a policy in place, they have to conduct a risk analysis, they have to do stakeholder engagement, they have to implement preventive and corrective measures depending on whether they identified potential or actual negative impacts. And then they have to implement a complaints and notification procedure that also encompasses heat stress, which is what I'm focusing on in my presentation, but this also could be applied very well to other aspects from the cocktail of hazards. And then they have to also conduct, do monitoring and potentially communicate. When looking at the protected human rights of the CSDDD, I've circled in the ones that are relevant in the context of climate change. So these are just the protected human rights. They're also protected environmental positions in the CSDDD. And this is a whole overview, but it's a little bit more abstract because the CSDDD actually has more detailed rights. For example, when looking at children's rights, there's provision of child labor, provision of the most severe forms of child labor. But there also is, for example, the right of the child to development and so on. And so, what are the rights that could be negatively impacted by climate change? Is obviously the right to life. When hearing the numbers that Halschka and Matthijs presented, the right to adequate working conditions, but also access to adequate housing, which is governed to the extent that housing is provided by company, but also access to food, access to water, access to sanitation, then potentially torture, inhumane and degrading treatment. In this context, we're probably talking about inhumane and degrading treatment. And then the CSDDD also has a protected legal position, which is basically an umbrella position that governs also other rights violations to rights that are not explicitly mentioned in the annex to the CSDDD, but are governed by the legal instruments to which the CSDDD takes recourse, for example, the United Nations Covenant on Civil and Political Human Rights or the Covenant on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights, but also many ILO conventions are referenced, and also the ILO core of fundamental rights and principles at work are mentioned in case this is foreseeable, and the right can be abused by a company and the behavior directly impairs this legal interest. So when looking into the due diligence management system, the risk management system of the CSDDD, starting with the risk analysis, we can divide this into 3 steps. I've actually adapted this from the ILO guidance that Halschka has also referenced in her presentation. So as a first step, companies should identify what hazards exist. Then next, like who might be harmed and how. And then they need to evaluate these risks in order to prepare, taking action on them. And for identifying these hazards, companies should look at what are possible heat-related hazards and what are the specific risks resulting from these in relation to safety and health. And then they should obviously be looking at different exposure scenarios depending on the job sector and specific tasks performed. We've heard in the 2 presentations before that the exposure scenarios can be very, very different. When looking at who might be harmed and how, obviously, there are different heat stress susceptibilities among workers and in different industries, and then evaluation of risks, this is prescribed by the CSDDD, has to be done according to likelihood and severity. So this is basically the prioritization of the adverse impact. Okay, diving a bit deeper into the potential assessment steps, first looking at product and country. So when a company is doing the analysis, they might not only be looking at their own operations, but in particular also at their business relationships in their chain of activity. So in parts of the value chain. And in order to identify who might be harmed and how, what are different exposure scenarios, what are the industries involved and so on, companies should first take a look at what am I actually procuring and what are the necessary production steps? What is the type of work that I have to do for the service or product that I'm procuring, including obviously all steps, including raw materials, disposal, transport, and then look at like what are the industries that are related to my product, to my service potentially in relation to all steps of the production. And in order to answer these questions, I should probably not be going through all of these details. Companies can engage with relevant departments internally, functions internally. So there's probably a lot of information already available. And they can also ask for information from their supplier. There might also be information from certain type of documentation, for example, from EMAS or ISO certifications. And then there might be other data sources for semi-finished raw materials, production and transport steps. Some of this information can also be derived from NACE, SIC, and NAICS codes. Next, companies should ask themselves from which countries or in which countries are we operating. So where are my own operations and where are my suppliers located, and what are the climatic and weather conditions in these locations. And here we have similar assessment steps. Additionally, companies can also look at DUNS numbers, and then they obviously can do research in relation to climatic or weather conditions in these countries. So looking at these steps in relation to the work and the workplace, so we have, you see there's a lot of questions we have to govern, but basically the potential sources here are the same ones. And a lot of these also relate to aspects that Matthias has mentioned in relation to addressing heat stress at work. So these workplace interventions that Matthias mentioned. What is duration intensity of the task? What are the work rest cycles? Is drinking water available? What are the environmental conditions? How about ventilation? What's the nature of the work? Do they have to use PPE? Are they exposed to sunlight or heat sources? Can they potentially rest in shade? And then the next assessment step would be, what are the different susceptibilities? Different levels of acclimatization, individual health conditions, particular vulnerabilities, for example, age, medication, medical conditions. And here again, you assess the workplace. You can also use potential self-assessment questionnaires from suppliers. Here you have to be aware, though, that the quality might vary and the reliability might be potentially limited, and therefore it's absolutely central that companies engage with workers. This is basically, we're talking about stakeholder engagement here, which is one of the due diligence obligations according to the CSDDD and necessary also in the context of the risk analysis. So workers' feedback on comfort levels, on heat-related illness symptoms are very central for this. And when looking at meaningful stakeholder engagement, here's a slide in relation to the CSDDD. The CSDDD actually clarifies not only that stakeholder engagement is a necessary step of the due diligence process, but also spells out when exactly companies have to do stakeholder engagement and what they have to do in order to do stakeholder engagement. So basically the how of the stakeholder engagement. And it is necessary for stakeholder engagement that they provide information to stakeholders to enable them to actually participate in the engagement in a meaningful way. Potentially, they might have to consult additionally with experts, but that only if stakeholder engagement is not possible to the extent required. And then companies need to identify and address barriers to stakeholder engagement. Most importantly, ensure that workers or stakeholders are protected from negative consequences resulting from the participation in the engagement. So when companies have identified, in the language of the CSDDD, potential or actual negative impacts resulting from heat or from the cocktail of hazards from climate change, they have to implement measures. The CSDDD requires that companies both implement preventive and corrective measures, and corrective measures also under certain requirements includes remediation. And these elements are not, you might have noticed that I haven't said this is under discussion in the context of the omnibus. None of this is actually being renegotiated. And when we're looking, and here I'm drawing on the great guidance, a resource from the ILO in relation to heat at work. There's 5 different types of measures that companies can implement. And in the language of the ILO, this is elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment. Elimination basically means that the source of the heat is being eliminated. This is not always possible. Substitution would then be the next step, and substitution means that you, for example, substitute a process, equipment, material, method with one that is less hazardous in relation to heat because, for example, it emits less heat, or because it is less physically strenuous for the worker, and therefore the workers themselves don't overheat as much, or it might be substituting activity outdoors or the time of the activity and so on. Then next, and companies can also obviously combine, sorry, I want to stay with the same slide. Companies can obviously also combine different measures here are engineering controls, and these are measures that address the heat at its source, for example, by using different heat building materials, ventilating a place, air cooling, or using water sprays. Then companies can use what the ILO calls administrative controls, which is basically workplace interventions. We've heard a lot about this already from Matthias, so this could be work-rest cycles, ensuring adequate hydration, making sure that sanitation is accessible, and so on. And lastly, personal protective equipment. We've already heard that personal protective equipment might actually be a source of additional heat stress when workers are working under heavy personal protective equipment that increases their exposure to heat stress. But certain types of personal protective equipment could also protect them. For example, clothing that protects from the sun. There's also different types of clothing that actually cools down the body. So personal protective equipment in certain scenarios could also be possible measures that companies implement. I want to now highlight the relevance of training and information to prevent heat stress. And this is so central because a lot of workers actually are not aware of heat stress, its consequences, the signs of heat-related illnesses, and only if workers are being made aware of this is it possible for them not only to actually meaningfully participate in stakeholder engagement, but actually also to protect themselves and participate in the measures that companies can implement. So training and information would also be part of the preventive measures that companies would have to implement. And companies can do this in different ways. They can do training programs, but they can also obviously use posters and infographics. And in this context, it could be, for example, really helpful to use posters or infographics in places where that workers are frequenting and where they're also staying for a little while, for example, in high-risk areas or in rest areas. And then on the slide, you can see a minimum information that should be encompassed by the training. So obviously that would be the risk of excessive heat, factors that contribute to heat stress, information in relation to hydration and how workers can identify this, for example, with urine color scales, then recognition treatment of heat-related illnesses, but also predisposing factors, signs, and symptoms. Then there should be clear responsibilities, and workers should also be informed in relation to employer responsibilities, but also their own duties. They should be informed in relation to their rights in this context. And then a couple more. What are the dangers of using drugs and alcohol? How could medication be used to manage health conditions in this context? What's the purpose of medical surveillance programs? What are acclimatization programs? How are they designed? How are they applied? So when doing this, and I mentioned this in the beginning, the company might not only be looking at their own operations, they might actually looking into their supply chain, into their chain of activity. In the language of the CSDDD in this context, it is key that they collaborate with their suppliers. And the most important step in this context, obviously, is to communicate with the supplier, and companies can do that both by entering into a dialogue with their suppliers, but also by using contracts and code of conducts, which are an important tool to not only communicate an expectation that companies have towards their suppliers, but also to make this expectation potentially legally enforceable. In this context, it's really important, and we've governed this in another webinar to ensure that the contract is actually done right, so that not only the company doesn't only merely shift their responsibility and obligation down to their supplier, but actually that burdens are shared fairly, and that companies actually collaborate with one another in a meaningful way instead of simply disengaging. Companies should do an assessment of their suppliers only on a risk-based approach, which also means that companies do this in a prioritized way instead of simply asking all of their suppliers the exact same questions every year, which is something that's been termed the bureaucracy monster here in Germany. And when receiving information from suppliers, it is central to check the plausibility, because very often, in particular, self-assessment questionnaires are not very reliable in practice. In this context, again, this is why it is so central that companies engage with stakeholders, because they know the situation that they're facing the best. And then also the development of measures should be risk-based and in collaboration with the supplier. Yeah, so I think I'm coming towards the end of my presentation and probably also towards the end of my time. On the next slide, very briefly, the plan to combat climate change according to Article 22 of the CSDDD. And you can see on the bottom right of the slide that this is something that is currently being renegotiated, and there's very different views expressed in relation to this. This doesn't change anything in relation to companies having to address operational safety and health risks, so the right to safe and adequate working conditions remains with the CSDDD and will not be renegotiated. So everything around the risk management system in this context stays as it is. But the plan to combat climate change is basically a plan for companies to ensure that their business model and strategy is in compliance with the 1.5 Celsius goal and the objective to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. It must be updated every 12 months, and the supervisory authorities assess whether the plan was adopted and its content is correct. And then you can see on the slide the content of the plan. So I will not go into all the details now, because I believe I've run out of time. So feel free to refer back to the slide when you receive them later on.
No worries, Misha. That was very helpful, very interesting as always. So thank you for walking us through the core of the due diligence duty through the lens of what it might mean to identify risks of heat-related hazards in a company's operations and supply chains. I think you also touched on the appropriateness of measures, the importance of training, as in, I think, also raising awareness, collaboration with suppliers. There is also a question that was asked to that regard, and I know that Matthias would want to answer that live later. So while we ask for more questions to come in, I would like to invite our last but surely not the least speaker on the virtual stage, Sasha Monique. If we could move to the next slide, please, Stuart. Thank you very much, Sasha Monique from Vimnopolet, Senior Sustainability Advisor. Vimnopolet is a member of amfori. We're really grateful for you to have agreed to share the journey that Vimnopolet has been on to when it comes to, well, first and foremost, becoming aware that this was an issue in the first place, right? And then raising awareness internally, externally. Yeah, if you want to tell us a little bit more about what you've done, how you have come about learning about this topic, and what's up next in your journey. Thank you, Sasha Monique.
Thank you so much, and thank you to amfori for allowing us to share a little bit of our experiences. I'm hoping to create some insight on who we are and what we've done, and hopefully also make it a little bit easier for companies that might be present here today to think, okay, what is it that we can do? So not everyone knows what Vinmonopolet is, so I thought I'd give you a quick introduction if we move to the next slide. And then also explain a little bit about how we got to learn more about heat stress and our focus on water, rest, shade, and sanitation, and then some key learnings that we got from that process. So who are we? If we move to the next slide, thank you. Vinmonopolet was established in 1922. We have the exclusive rights to sell spirits, wine, and strong beer. Anything that's more than 4.7%, that's in a closed bottle, you would have to purchase from our stores in Norway. We're a state-owned company. and we report to the Norwegian Ministry of Health and Care Services. And yes, the word monopoly is indeed in our name, Vinmonopolet, the wine monopoly. And we were established in 1922 to limit the harmful effects of alcohol in our society through responsible sales and limited availability, and then also absence to marketing. So you will not find any marketing within Norway or within our stores on alcohol. Our product selection, though, is some of the highest in the world. We have about 45 to 40,000 products per year that are available on our platforms. We do have 351 stores, but we are also obliged to cover the whole of Norway. So if you live a certain distance from our stores, we will also deliver to your door for free. We are experts in age verification, so our stores are continually monitored for making sure that they do not sell to those that are underage. And then whilst we limit access, we also are known for the best customer service in Norway. We also do not purchase products directly. We have 810-ish wholesalers. We've actually just reduced the number from 2024 to 2025. But here we could say that between us as a company and the products that are being produced, there are many different tiers. And our next tier is our wholesaler. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that, because we found out that the tiers within our supply chain, especially when it comes to rum, are quite complex. So you would wonder, how did we learn about heat stress? And as a Nordic monopoly all the way in Norway, how are we now focusing on it in our supply chains? So for the next slide, I could tell you that the report that started it all was titled "Give Them a Break." It's the Fair Food report that focused on working conditions in Nicaragua. And at that time, La Isla had then not had so many partners within the industry working on this specific issue as of yet, but they did have other NGOs and research colleagues that helped them to start looking into what are the factual grounds of accusations for CKD&T, what's chronic kidney disease of unknown origin, and then also heat stress. Now, usually as a company, one would have assessed factual grounds on accusations by following it up with interventions such as inspections or audits. And what we very quickly realized after we started looking into the first audits is that you cannot assume that heat stress is a topic within supply chains, even if it has become more known. Back in 2018, it wasn't necessarily picked up by social auditors. And then also traceability of molasses is a challenge. We specifically looked into sugarcane production, and between sugarcane and molasses, and then eventually rum, there are so many different tiers and processes that take place that one might be, as a retailer, slightly skeptical to digging that deep. But what we did find out, though, is once you start asking questions on traceability, organizations within your supply chain or companies within your supply chain also have a larger focus on it. So do not be afraid to start asking, where does this product actually come from? We also found out that we needed a new approach. We needed partners to be able to work with us. And yes, auditing standards could be those, specifically in certification of then sugarcane. We started talking to Bonsucro. We started looking at the sources of reports and contacting La Isla Network to find out how is it that they've conducted their research, where do they see are the biggest risks, and how do we work together on that? And then also bringing this to the other monopolies' attention, because there are indeed 5 different monopolies within the Nordics that sells alcoholic beverages. If we move to the next slide. Thank you. So Vinmonopolet has a commitment that we should look into decent work for all. And we already started this commitment many years ago, but we realized that this was not enough. Vinmonopolet uses the amfori BSCI code of conduct in our supply chains, and that should ideally be traced all the way down into where you would find the raw products being produced. However, if you started asking these questions, you'll find out that it might stop somewhere along the way. And therefore, it was very important for us to start having industry dialogue on our code of conduct. We've also included in our general purchasing conditions. And that's what I always say to companies first that contact me and say, how do I start working with this? I say, what's in your general purchasing conditions? And is it understood that all actors in the supply chain need to take responsibility? We also have the same code as all the other monopolies in the Nordics. And we started having conversations with amfori about heat stress. And they then went in and signed a memorandum of understanding with La Isla Network. And that's partly why La Isla Network is one of the presenters today. And we also realized that commitment doesn't cover the whole of the OECD process. When one speaks about all of these legislations, there's one process, one wheel that covers them all, which is the OECD process. And commitment is step one. But one also needs to identify and you need to mitigate. Next slide, please. So what did we do? We went to our management and the industry and we said, we have a problem. Lives are at risk. People need to get assistance in preventing heat stress. We informed and gained support from our own management internally. We also informed our owners. We placed this risk on the agenda for the other Nordic monopolies, amfori, and also our importers, where we in 2019 had a joint event for importers and the rum industry to place this specific risk. And we've been very vocal about it in other spheres as well. We've ordered trainings by Bonsucro, which is a certification body with, or certification standard within the sugarcane industry, where La Isla is the ones who are conducting the training. And these trainings are open to all within our supply chain. And I believe that it's also just been shared, the next set of trainings, in the chat or in the question and answer section today. And I would like to encourage everyone that's present today to actually attend those trainings. They're open to all. They give you very practical guidelines on how it is that within agriculture, one can prevent heat stress. And we also supported La Isla Network into, if we can move back, thank you, into interventions where they went and measured workers' exposure to heat stress. The picture on the right here is one of those visits that we did. And they measured in both Cuba and Jamaica. And we found, interestingly enough, that some things are the same. If you do provide workers with 10 minutes of break during a working hour, their bodies recover more quickly. They do not necessarily have to drink as much water, but they do need the shade that helps them to cool down. Next slide, please. So we were challenged when we were going to present today, what were our key learnings through the process that we've gone through the years? And they are the following. You need good partners. If you're going to create interventions, make sure that you use expertise like with La Isla Network and Bonsucro. Use them to help you carry your message. Know and involve your supply chain. As I mentioned earlier, traceability may be difficult, but it's not impossible. The more you ask of your sub-suppliers to give you information, the more they're willing to give you. At operations, you would find that management really do need understanding and buy-in. So to start creating these programs, it might even be that you need to speak to a bigger industry within that local population in that country to create buy-in and support this movement, because essentially it is a movement to make sure that there are better working conditions. And it does help if you have local authorities that follow along as well. Our message also needed to change from risk to human health and death to prevention. Companies find it easier to work with the concepts of prevention and positive impact on health, because essentially no company wants to be part of a message saying there are people dying in my supply chain. And that is really unfortunate, because one could be brave enough to say that, but it's easier for them to understand the words prevention, positive impact on health. One should never forget rights holder dialogue. Involve unions and workers at the workplace that you will be conducting interventions at, and create an understanding on the impact. Because management can say, you need to sit down and have a 10-minute break. However, they might not want to do it because they're working on piece rate. They want to not miss out on income. What they then need to understand is that they'll actually be better at their work if they've gotten that break and if they're healthier over time. And then one should take into consideration that working in risk countries might have insecurity. So what we see within sugarcane, for example, is that many of the countries would have had a higher risk rating. There's more insecurity, there might be higher rates of violence or instability, and with that comes its own challenges. And very often these challenges are also economic. So do not place the economic burden of creating interventions just on the producer. Try and help them by purchasing equipment that might assist, even if it's just something like a water cooler or a shaded tent that could assist in creating that change that you would like in your supply chain. And then also look to certifications and auditing standards such as amfori, Bonsucro, and so forth to assist in monitoring change. And thank you so much to also opening up this specific session for those that are social auditors in our supply chains, because this now creates the possibility for them to also start looking into heat stress. But I think that was all the time that I had today, and I do look forward to some questions.
Thank you so much, Sasha Monique, for this very candid way of sharing some of the learnings also that you have acquired throughout this journey. I think that was very practical, and I hope that many of the businesses, the companies, the brands here online will relate to some of the challenges that you have encountered, and also some of the ways you have overcome them. So this is the time for the Q&A. Maybe I would like to invite my colleague Benita from the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles to take over. I know that you mentioned also amfori, Sasha Monique, and how we came about working also with La Isla Network in this webinar, in a previous webinar. I know that there is a question, and my colleague, if I could just maybe give her a chance to respond to a question about amfori BSCI, since there have been a back and forth, and maybe that is the easiest way of doing it, because precisely I should probably say that in 2022, when we did revise the amfori BSCI system and also the auditing questions at the time, it was also really thanks to the understanding of the protocol that La Isla Network alluded to, with greater references to the importance of water, shade, rest, and sanitation. But maybe, Benita, to you, and if you believe that we can immediately give the floor to my colleague Sonia, that could be one way of doing it. I see that there are plenty of questions, so we need to also give space to others. But over to you.
Yes, thank you, Valentina. I'm happy to moderate the Q&A session today, and taking over now. We have roughly 10 minutes left. We have a lot of questions, so thank you first of all for putting your questions in the chat during the presentations. And I agree, Valentina, I would like to give amfori the floor first to answer the question on BSCI audits.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of amfori about our audit process. I guess that's really the reason why this webinar was also recognized as CPD. And I also would like to thank the participant for his or her thoughtful thoughts about how heat stress is included in our methodology. But in fact, I have to say that it's absolutely right. Excessive heat is a complex issue. It intersects multiple performance areas in the BSCI system. And while PS 75 specifically addresses environmental conditions, the holistic nature of the BSCI audit means that heat stress can, or better said, should be addressed or assessed through broader lens, including risk assessments covered by PA1, worker involvement covered by PA2, emergency preparedness covered by PA6, and of course the PA7 that is linked with the health and safety systems. So regarding the specific question asked by the participant, our monitoring partners, so the auditors, are expected to evaluate not only the physical conditions on the site, but also the systems in place to manage risks, like the heat stress. And this includes, for example, checking documental policies and procedures, evidences of risk assessments, mitigation plans, for example, adjusted working hours that were referred here also, hydration protocols, shade or sun exposure, sanitation. It also includes checking for worker feedback and complaints on this topic, compliance with legal thresholds for temperature and the working conditions. So therefore, despite our system is already covering all those topics, we do acknowledge that there is room for greater specificity in how excessive heat is flagged and reported. And this is an area that is under active review on our side. And your inputs are always valuable in helping shaping the future improvements to the audit methodology. So thank you for raising the topic, and thank you all to contribute for the dialogue on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, for stepping in. Yes, unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left, and we have received quite a couple of questions. Some of them have been answered already in the chat directly. So thank you to the speakers. I would like to raise one question that was posted in the chat, not directed to any speaker in particular, but maybe if you feel that you can answer that question, feel free to answer. The question is, should heat stress and climate-related risks for workers be addressed within environmental or decarbonization policies? If so, how? Does anybody want to answer that question?
Sorry, could you repeat it one more time for me?
Yes. Should heat stress and climate-related risks for workers be addressed within environmental or decarbonization policies? If so, how?
Difficult one. To be honest, I did not spend much time thinking about it. We often see that that mitigation is something quite different than adaptation, and the CO2 emissions and decarbonization is often for a company easier because you have like simple goals and simple data and figures that you can change. And for some organizations, it's easier to focus on the mitigation and the adaptation because there's so many social factors involved and so many supply chain partners that it's more complex. Probably depends on your own organization and how long or strong or short your supply chain is, whether you can combine it. In the end, we should do both, I think.
Thank you. Halshka, did you also want to step in?
Yes, thanks, Benita. I think it's a good question, and I think it's something that the ILO deals with through different departments, whether that's green jobs and just transition, moving towards low carbon societies. I think the key here is that decarbonization absolutely and needs to be a national and also an enterprise priority. However, what we see is that it's a long-term priority. It's something that needs to be implemented in various stages. It could have various types of timelines, right? But usually it's something that is implemented and needs significant adjustments to the workplace, to the enterprise, to the supply chain, to make some kind of market change. However, the difference here when we're talking about heat stress and workers' rights is that workers are dying now. They're being injured now. And so the difference is that the Adaptation strategies are something that, as many of the speakers today presented, we have evidence for strategies that work. These are strategies that need to be implemented now, whereas decarbonization policies are something, yes, in parallel as well, but more in a longer term strategy, right? And so it's two different things. Today we're talking about adaptation. It's something that needs to be implemented as a priority to protect lives. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Halska. I would like to move on to another question now. There's one question directed to Michaela, and the question is that you mentioned that it is necessary to verify the credibility of self-assessment. Would you give some recommendations for companies how to do this?
I mean, I think this is probably something for longer discussion. Generally, I am not a big fan of self-assessment questionnaires in general, because the information content of them is so very limited because of the reliability. And one thing you can do from the start is to work on the question design. So questions like, do you employ children? Yes, no, I confirm that I comply with all laws and regulations. Obviously are not very meaningful because nobody's going to say, yes, I employ children. No, I don't comply with all laws. And so with the design of the question, you can already ask for more meaningful content, but you should do this only on a risk-based, based on a risk-based approach, because otherwise this is going to create a lot of work for suppliers. And if you want to ask things in relation to heat stress, some like guiding questions could be questions that you can find in my slides, for example, but also in the ILO guidance on heat-related hazards and heat at work. So asking for example, work rest schedules, asking for rotation, asking for cooling measures could be something that is helpful. And then in order to verify plausibility, stakeholder engagement is key, but also looking at information from other actors, for example, looking at publicly available information, looking at potentially information from media, but your best bet in this context really is engaging with stakeholders, in this context, workers.
Okay, thank you, Michaela. We have 2 minutes left. I think that gives us the opportunity to answer one last question. I would like to answer the question that is also not directed to anyone in particular. So how can companies incorporate human rights into their future scenarios? Does anyone very quickly want to answer that question? Maybe in 1 or 2 minutes. Matthijs?
Yeah, I did answer it already online as well in the chat, but it is a future scenario. So if you don't act now, your company and your business will be in harm's way. So I think it's really important that you really start thinking about the scenarios. You see already GDP and labor hours going down. So if you want to protect your own business, if you want to protect your people, it should be a future scenario, and its future is, I don't think it's future, it's a scenario now. That if I'm talking to a lot of companies and they see it happening on a day-to-day basis. So waiting is always an option, but it's not the best option at the moment. So I think it's really important to start mapping your risks to know what's going on in your supply chain so you can act.
Great, thank you. Sasha, Monique, do you quickly want to add something on that?
I can only support the points that have been made already. Being Monopole has now, for the 3rd year in a row, reported on what's called the Norwegian Transparency Act. That's the preluder to CSDDD. But we started this work way before. And I think that one thing that one needs to take into consideration is, if you're going to pitch this to a business, is that this makes business sense. Making sure that people in your supply chain have safe, good working conditions, it's the right thing to do. And it's also your brand at the end of the day. So you want to be a company that's known for being responsible. And that means that you need to act in a responsible manner when you source. So like Matthias says, it's not the future, it's the now. And it's now part of making business sense. So a first place to start would be a human rights policy or a responsible business policy, but build on that and make sure that it actually reflects what you're doing within the supply chain.
Great. Thanks, Sasha, Monique. We have now come to the end of the Q&A session. I'm sorry that we could not answer all of your questions. There are a lot of questions left. Due to our time constraints, we could not answer them all. But now we have already moved on to the next slides, and we would very much appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. You can use the QR code here on the slide and then follow the instructions accordingly. We very much would appreciate your feedback, as we are always eager to learn, to hear your insights, and to use then that information and take it into consideration for the organization of the next webinars. Yes, and that leaves me with saying thank you to all of you for joining today's webinar. I hope you have learned a lot from our speakers, who I would also like to thank very much. Thanks to Hauschka, Matthijs, Michaela, and Sasha, Monique. And of course, also a big thank you to Valentina and her team for hosting this webinar, for organizing it. And with this, I would like to close today's webinar. I hope you all have a good rest of the day and see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.